I'm going to tell you how you can grow tons of food with no work. Now, wait a minute. People say it's impossible to grow food with no work, that growing your own food takes tons of work and hard, long days like the Amish. And as someone who grew up doing the whole farming thing and has worked on farms of all different scales and all sorts of different aspects of the industry, I used to agree with that until I discovered permaculture and it changed the way I thought about things. For example, one day I was working doing a bunch of weeding, and then I went on a bike ride afterwards and found this place where there were just tons of blackberries. So I went back home and grabbed a few buckets, 3 big buckets, and filled up like 3 5-gallon buckets filled with black raspberries. And the thing is, I would come back here all season long for blackberries, for elderberries, wild grapes, and there were all sorts of vegetables too, wild alliums and onions and garlic and asparagus growing here, all sorts of great things. There was an apple tree, there was a pear tree, tons of mulberries, everything like that, nuts growing everywhere. And I realized the only people working this were like the deer coming to maybe nibble on some things and then poop, and that was it. And I thought, I'm doing this wrong. So I went home and I redesigned part of my garden to be exactly like this sort of hedgerow. And guess what? It works just as well live at home as it did there in the park. After that, I started seeing all sorts of old ecosystems around like this. Like this one, I've actually been to 3 places that had just huge fields of garlic growing wild like this. And it's super productive year after year. Really, no one's maintaining it. I went to this one over about 10 years of time and was harvesting garlic from it. And it's just not being maintained. It's kicking out tons of garlic. And that's not it either. You also see some like motherwort in there and some other greens and other things growing there. And the trees in the background were all like a lot of crab apples. There were autumn olives there, mulberries, of course, black walnuts overhead. This was a complete food producing edible ecosystem. And this one is up in northern Michigan. This is a really special place because you see all this big grassland. The whole understory of all that sparse grass is just filled with wild strawberries that grow really nice sized, juicy, sweet strawberries with nobody doing any work. There's also a ton of field mint growing in there with it, monarda, which you can harvest to eat as like an oregano, and there were ground cherries in there, and sorrel growing all through there too, which is like a lemony flavored spinach. It was this complete food producing system. I'm told by the owners that it had been producing like this for about 50 years with almost no human management at all, except every few years they might come through and mow this area. That's it. Here's another place at Turkey Run in Indiana where you just look around and everything's edible. The overstories like black walnuts and pecans and hickories, and there are hazelnuts in here, elderberries, all the shrubs everywhere you see are edible in some of these places. It's pawpaws, it's persimmons, all that. You look at the understory and it's just dense with food. Things that are really expensive like ramps and fairy spuds and stuff like that. And it's more food in that understory than I've ever seen, like a farm field. And yet the overstory is all this productive stuff too. Every place I've gone, from far to the north to down to the tropics, and from the East Coast to the West Coast in North America and in Europe, you see natural food producing systems like this just kicking it out. Nobody doing any kind of work. And guess what? You can bring those home and they work just as well there too. So we can design systems to produce a lot more food than you ever thought possible on a lot less work than you could imagine. Are there really no work systems? No, of course not. But it's a whole lot more than you could ever imagine.